Thank you. So I'm on the clock here. Uh, I wanted to start with what's going on now in the Ukraine war. I think the military uh, is going to be tested, is being tested in the Ukraine war. I tell you, it is the most complex, consequential national security management uh, series of decisions a president, President Biden, and an administration have had to make since the Cold War. And actually, if you go back, it might be since World War II. Think about what's going on. The whole structure and goals of the United States military is based on deterrence, stopping and preventing war. What happened in the Ukraine war is deterrence failed. Putin decided to invade Ukraine, and there were great diplomatic and intelligence efforts designed to stop that. It didn't work. So we are living in the midst of this complex war. The president, the military, the whole Biden administration's, think about it, each day has to look and say, how many howitzers can we send to Ukraine? How can we aid? How can we do it in a way that helps Ukraine but does not trigger an escalation on the part of Vladimir Putin? That, when you look at it just from a distance and do some reporting on it, is one of the most difficult series of questions that an administration has had to face. And unfortunately, in the United States, I think we've become kind of numb to the war and the consequence. I would argue that it's something to focus on a daily basis. I want to really quickly, Thomas sent me a series of 17 questions he wants me to answer. I'm going to try to answer a couple of them. The first was, how did I get into the military? It's 1961. I'm going to college, and it was thought at the time that at least in the Midwest, where I was coming from high school, that the draft is inevitable. In the closet of our home was my father's Navy uniform. He'd served in World War II, in fact, been on the island of Tinian when the plane took off to drop the first bomb, atomic bomb on Japan. At the time, 1961, John Kennedy was president. If you recall, it was a PT 109. He was the Navy hero. So I signed up for the military. 1965, I graduated as an ensign. My first duty station at age 22, I was assigned to the USS Wright, a command ship. Actually, it was what was called the National Emergency Command Post afloat, where the president would go if he decided to go to a ship at a time of nuclear war. At age 22, I worked with one other officer, and we had custodial control of the nuclear authentication codes for starting or responding to a war. Others have written about and studied the flaws in that system. But what I found astonishing, at the young age, I was given not only that job, but I was in charge of the circuit control, the radio men who maintain top secret point to point communication continuously with then the eight syncs, sync pack, the Strategic Air Command, and so forth. We were a floating Pentagon in very many ways. The lesson I took from that, and I'm sure all of you who've been in the military or study it, a system is based on trust. The idea that a 22-year-old would be given this responsibility in a way makes no sense. At the same time, they put people in jobs. I think they put me in a job because I'd been a radio ham at the lowest level, novice license. On that basis, or the random selection, I was at a point of seeing the real world system that was in place to use nuclear weapons. And in fact, as a reporter, I spent 50 years looking at that and really have never written it. Now, the second job I had was sent as communications officer on the USS Fox, a guided missile frigate where we had nuclear weapons. I was, as the communications officer, this is a time now, 1968, 69. Believe it or not, there was no satellite communications. Communication system was built around high frequency communication. Essentially, the short wave band was unreliable. On our ship, we would be going along and we would lose the fleet broadcast. We would lose communication regularly. Again, one of the accidents, a couple of tech reps came aboard and had built a new receiver that was about this big. It was just a little box, and they loaned us two of them. It was one of the most advanced receivers made. We used it for a couple of weeks, and my God, we never lost contact. Very important. The chief who was working for, I'll never forget his name, Haber, said, we need to keep these receivers. He said, get on your knees if necessary to get these technical representatives to let us keep the receivers. It worked. We were able for months to maintain continuous communication. The skipper of the ship, Captain Ward, was a communication specialist. He sent out confidential reports about how we did this, and the whole system in the 7th Fleet about maintaining communications. Good lesson in the military and everything else, and that is be willing to get down on your knees to get what you need. The third assignment was as a routine watch officer in the Pentagon, working for Admiral Moore, who was then the chief of naval operations. It was a very routine job, but I saw the top secret traffic that went back and forth about the Vietnam War, and it was so clear that the bombing sorties were not very effective. And of course, everyone, the Secretary of Defense then, Laird and Admiral Moore, were saying, and President Nixon, interestingly enough, saying, the bombing is great. I knew that the bombing was not great and really not achieving its mission. But Admiral Moore, I got to know him a little bit. He decided to make me a courier. One day, send some top secret documents in an envelope over to the Nixon White House. I sat waiting outside the Situation Room. There was a man with gray hair and a white shirt, very distinguished looking, and it's like two people waiting, sitting next to each other on a transatlantic flight. His name was Mark Felt, became deputy director of the FBI, and the source later identified as deep throat for the Watergate reporting that Carl Bernstein and I did. The other interesting, I think, important lesson from the military, they often tell you, don't volunteer. I think that's wrong. I think it's really important to volunteer. And when I went to the Washington Post in September 1971, I covered night police. 9 months later was a burglary in the Democratic headquarters at the Watergate. It was one of the most beautiful days in Washington ever. And the early editors said, we got this strange burglary. Who would be dumb enough to come in and work today? Because I volunteered for everything. They said, number one candidate who would be dumb enough to come in today was me. And they sent me to the courthouse to see the burglars and see them arraigned. And it was one of those moments where the lead burglar, James McCord, finally told the judge that he'd been previously worked for the CIA. I was sitting there in the courtroom, first row or second row, and when he said that, I blurted out, holy shit. Namely, the burglars that had broken into the Democratic headquarters, the lead burglar was a CIA lead security officer. So the next day, 6 of us had written a story, but then following on Sunday, 2 reporters came to work on the story. Virginia reporter named Carl Bernstein and myself. And it was an institution that gave us the running room to do that story. And so those are some of the military experiences I've had, which I have often said that after the Navy, particularly being at sea, some reporters working really did great stories about the Navy recently, ProPublica, showing that people couldn't perform because they were exhausted. Life at sea is exhausting, and there have been some reforms as a result of that terrific reporting. So I'm going to stop, but don't forget the Ukraine war. And I not only, I've done 22 books now, 3 books on Trump, including the audio version of 8 or 9 hours I did with Trump the last year of his presidency. He agreed to these interviews. It's not clear exactly why. Maybe a panel of psychiatrists will be able to answer that question in years or decades. But it is the real Trump, and you see who he is, and you see the negligence and the failure to understand his role as president, the importance of democracy, and the importance of the president who has the overall responsibility for protecting the people. So let me stop there. Thank you. I'm going to listen to your symposium. You are kind to invite me. Thank you again.